Perfect.
I'm actually an orthopedic surgeon. I did my medical school at University of Rochester, New York, and I did a spine fellowship there. So I'm really, this is way out of I didn't expect to be in this fight. I trained in the Navy and I served on the Navy Research Advisory Committee where we looked at defense strategies for the Navy, technology actually. And by law, they have to have a physician on it. And I guess it's made me a little bit skeptical about lots of things. But when I look at this, I mean, I do think the point about the bioweapon is pertinent, and there's a lot to be said about that. That takes about an hour. But the point I was thinking when we were talking about this earlier, about what people were seeing, we're not just seeing bleeding problems. We're also seeing, I've had these two stories that didn't involve, menses or blood. They involved a woman who was a hairdresser, and everybody in her office everybody in her salon got vaccinated except her. And she kept getting sick for about 2 weeks after everybody else got vaccinated. But it was more like flu-like, COVID-like symptoms. And then the other one I just heard today from an orthopedic colleague is an older friend of his he got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. He had 3 days of illness. His mother, who lived with him, was 88 years old. She did not get the vaccine, but she got COVID and died right then. So this brought up to me, I started thinking about mode of acquisition, because when I first heard the thing about people are asking about you mentioned shedding. So I asked Judy Mikovits about that, and she didn't, because my problem with that is, if we're talking about the spike protein, which is just part of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, one wouldn't think initially that a portion of a virus is going to be transmissible. Normally, viruses go out through your, the cells, you breathe them out. It's little virions squeak out and float around and infect people. But this isn't the whole virus. The spike protein is just part of it. So could it be airborne? That's one possibility. The other one is a serum-borne thing, but that doesn't explain things like this guy's mother, and probably not a lot of the women that you're seeing. And then there's also fecal oral transmission. I guess that could explain all of this. That's one way we could transmit maybe a whole virus. But again, we're not being given a whole virus. This thing produces the pathogen head, the spike protein pathogen in your cells. And then the other one I thought about is, what's the definition of a prion? A prion is a misfolded protein. And what the way they weaponized the spike protein essentially is they inserted a gene into the spike protein that allows it to have a furin cleavage. And so that can be changed conformationally to then bind with your ACE2 pathway. So what you're talking about is an artificial 3D conformation, which sounds a lot like a prion to me. And those things are really, that's a self-replicating protein that can be transmitted through serum for sure. We don't know how else it's transmitted, but that also seems to be a little bit unlikely, because it takes years usually to see prion disease. I'm just thinking this through. Now, Dr. Madej talked about the stuff in the vaccine. I think it's interesting to note they call that biolipid, that nanoparticle lipid that they encase the RNA. It's called matrix M. Don't you love that name? But the other thing about that is, in terms of this bleeding, and in terms of your immune system, it turns out that the matrix M also has the adjuvant. And by itself, it can tune up your immune system even without a pathogen. And it has a part of the adjuvant is from a bark in the South American tree. It's called the Quilarha saponaria or something, and they're called saponins. And I bring this up because when I look back at the original research of them trying to develop matrix M, they talk about the problem of bleeding. It strips erythrocytes of their hemoglobin. It changes the conformation of the erythrocytes, which that's what Dr. Madej just said. It also damages the endothelium. And there's one more thing it does to the blood, but it causes something to do with antibody adhesions to cellular. Oh no, I know it causes lymphocyte destruction. So there's a lot of this thing. There's a lot of moving parts in this vaccine that could be, that could be the issue. And I think what needs to be said here is that like any good crime, we're trying to sort out. we need to figure out how it was done. And I really think transmission is the issue. And I'm starting to think the spike protein itself can be transmitted, because the other thing I looked at just from people that have been having the vaccine, I just looked and did my own little study that I couldn't get published yet, but it's going in, I guess. I looked for bleeding, words that were about bleeding, and I looked for thrombocytopenia in the VAERS. And in a 2-month period in the VAERS, there were, just using the terms I used, I pulled out 358 cases. And when you read them, you're hearing exactly what you guys are talking about: abnormal menses, clots, large amounts of bleeding, unusual menses, and then all sorts of bleeding problems: brain bleeds, GI bleeds, bleeds from old scars, weird bleeding like an old healed boil wound and it just started spontaneously bleeding, men oozing blood from their legs. So this is, if you know, and what my point in doing this paper was, when you look at thalidomide and all the bad things that came out of that drug, one of the ways we stopped it was that they recognized that it was a gradient of the same problem. You know, that the way it presented was birth defects, but it wasn't all just children with no arms. It was a gradient down to just little ring things on your finger. And I think that's what we're seeing here. Whatever this is that's doing this, it's, you know, the clots, the cavernous sinus thrombosis that Dr. Tenpenny and I talked about, that is so rare. We're seeing clots, we're seeing bleeding, we're seeing a lot of things that have to do with, that could be what we're talking about with the saponins, with the endothelium. But again, it might just be the spike protein. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out because those were my thoughts on it. Because and I'd just be curious to know how many of these secondary illnesses were due to people getting the Johnson & Johnson. It seemed to be, because we're dealing with two different technologies here, the DNA technology versus the RNA technology. And I just wonder if that's something we've sorted out, because we just started hearing about this. The bleeding started early on, and it's not, I mean, that's with all of them. That's the ones I looked at. That I just looked at Pfizer and Moderna, and that was 358 cases in two months or less. So I guess I would be curious to know if the secondary effects we're seeing